The Ukraine war has dragged on in violent fashion since Russia invaded its neighbor more than 3 years ago. Uncertainties surround President Trump's growing push to negotiate an end to the conflict that has taken on vast geopolitical and security dimensions, impacting the US, Western Europe, and NATO, while Russian President Vladimir Putin has tightened Moscow's alignment with such US adversaries as China and North Korea. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor at the Washington Times, and for this edition of the Threat Status Influencers series, we're joined by Daniel Hoffman, a retired high-level CIA officer and expert on Russia, who is also a Times columnist and a regular contributor to the Threat Status Daily newsletter. We're also lucky to have Times national security correspondent Ben Wolfgang, who has closely reported on U.S. policy toward Russia and Ukraine across the past 4 U.S. administrations. Dan and Ben, thank you for doing this.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks.
Dan, we're at what feels like a critical possibility of negotiations to end the war. You have a unique perspective, having once served as CIA station chief in Moscow. When we assess the prospects for peace, can Vladimir Putin really be trusted? Is Russia actually interested in a fair and peaceful settlement of the war? And what really is Putin's goal? What was his goal in invading Ukraine, and what is it now at this stage?
So first of all, we are at a new stage because we have a new administration with a new strategy. The Biden team had this as long as it takes strategy, which harkened back for a lot of voters to a forever war that was just going to last forever. And I think that the Biden administration kept Ukraine in the fight, but didn't put them in a position to secure a peace deal or win. As far as Vladimir Putin, I can tell you I spent my career at CIA trying to see the world through his twisted KGB eyes. And he's looking for not necessarily a negotiated settlement. What he really wants, his strategic objective from the beginning, was to topple the government of Ukraine and install a puppet regime loyal to the Kremlin. He's failed at that. He had roughly 7% of Ukrainian territory when he launched the invasion. Now it's up to about 18%. And the government is holding fast and has thoroughly bloodied the Russian army. Putin has suffered massive hundreds of thousands of casualties, spilled a lot of blood and treasure. But he's successfully swiveled in the direction, as you noted, to China, where Russia exports their hydrocarbons, to Iran, where they receive drones. And of course, Iran now has a drone factory inside Russia, and they're getting a lot of artillery and soldiers they're using as cannon fodder from North Korea. So I think Putin feels like he can carry on the fight. Now, he can have negotiations and talk about a ceasefire, and if he thinks he can win at the negotiating table what he has lost so far on the battlefield, he might talk a little bit, but I think he understands he's not going to get what he wants, full control over Ukraine. So I think that's where we're at. I'm sorry to be pessimistic. When I was at CIA, I think I was routinely pretty pessimistic when I was testifying on Capitol Hill and briefing the White House. It's just the way it is when you're dealing with Russia.
Well, Dan, let's flip this question around then and look at the other side of the equation. What is it that should be Ukraine's goal at this point? As you said, 3 years into the war, having garnered billions of dollars in military support from the U.S. and Europe, and to a large degree fended off the Russian forces. What should their strategy be going forward, and what should Ukraine be looking for in any deal?
So I think what Ukraine wanted to do was blunt the Russian attack and retain their territorial integrity to the extent that they could, and their independence. And they've done that. They were at risk. Look, the Biden administration sent Zelensky a plane to evacuate him when the war began, and Zelensky famously said, I don't need ammunition. I don't need a plane, I need ammunition. The fight's here. And 3 years into the fight, Ukraine is out there, and Zelensky is leading his country. What Ukraine wants, they definitely want peace. Look, Russia's the aggressor, Ukraine the victim. Putin could stop the war anytime. Ukraine wants a ceasefire deal, a peace deal, but they also need some security guarantees to deter a future Russian attack. Part of that is no limits on indigenous domestic military buildup, so Ukraine's got to have a strong defense. They're going to need support from Europe. It might mean European soldiers on the ground in Ukraine, and they're definitely going to need a lot of military equipment from the United States and from Europe. And look, from the United States perspective, why do we care? Well, Ukraine is fighting for their freedom and against an imperial land grab from Russia. But also, if Ukraine were to fall, I think Putin would cast a shadow over Europe and the $1 trillion worth of trade we enjoy with Europe. And that would be of concern to our national security.
Dan, in order to spur peace talks toward end of war negotiations, we've seen some major twists and turns at the start of the Trump administration. We saw the fiery exchange between Zelensky and Trump and J.D. Vance at the White House. Critics of President Trump say that he's pandering to Putin to try and draw the Russians into agreeing to a ceasefire, and that pandering is dangerous. Is Trump demanding too little from Russia at this point? And is he pandering, and is it dangerous? How do you see those questions?
So he definitely laid out some preconditions to get Russia to the negotiating table for a ceasefire. He's trying to entice Russia, rather as opposed to Ukraine, which I would argue the Trump team induced Ukraine to agree to a ceasefire without security guarantees, which Ukraine did. But for Putin, it was, look, Ukraine's not going to join NATO. They will not go back to the 2014 border. We paused on military assistance, paused on intelligence to get Ukraine to agree to the ceasefire. President Trump was hoping was that he could maybe secure a grand bargain with Russia, where if Russia agrees to a ceasefire and potentially a peace deal, that we eliminate some or all of the sanctions, bring Russia back into the fold. I don't know whether that's got a chance of success. There's probably three options. One was the Biden one, which is just keep Ukraine in the fight for as long as it takes, which wasn't working. The other one was to try to entice Russia to the negotiating table. The third, which neither Biden nor Trump pursued, was to give Ukraine enough weapons that they could actually push Russia back and make it clear to Putin that this war is going to threaten his regime, as it almost did when Prigozhin, the former now dead Wagner commander, launched that failed mutiny. So this is the Trump team's strategy, and I think what I would expect based on my experience is that he's talking to his consigliere, John Ratcliffe, director of CIA, and asking, what are Putin's plans and intentions? What are Putin's pain points? How can we influence Putin's behavior? And if there's intelligence showing that this might work, then have at it.
Dan, you mentioned the idea of a grand deal. The Ukraine war has brought China and Russia closer together. You've mentioned North Korean troops obviously fighting alongside Russian troops now. Some argue it should be a major, bigger picture strategy of the Trump administration to try to drive a wedge between some of the members of the axis of tyranny or axis of autocracies, whatever you want to call it, especially between Moscow and Beijing, the so-called wedge strategy. Do you see that right now in the Trump administration's approach? Is there a concerted effort to try and sort of cleave off members of that axis?
I think they'd like to do it. And I think the Ukraine war has been the oxygen for the growth of that axis of tyranny. But Russia, make no mistake, is kind of on their knees. They rely on China for export of their hydrocarbons at much reduced revenue for Russia. Iran and Russia are long-term strategic competitors, and Russia is definitely in great need of Iranian drones. And of course, North Korea is getting a lot out of the support they're giving Russia. They're getting technology to build more effective intercontinental ballistic missiles. So it's all good for those other countries. It's tilted in their favor, and Russia has no choice. As far as whether you can break that axis of tyranny, let's just remember that we're on the side of democracy and they're not. So they have a reason to support one another. And it's awfully hard for me to imagine that we could break them. But one way to do it is by ending the war in Ukraine. Certainly that would be a positive step. The question is how we end it. If we end it in such a way that Putin is the winner, or that Ukraine is unable to defend themselves going forward, and Putin is able to launch a follow-on attack in a year or two and destroy Ukraine, well, that's only going to enhance that connectivity between those four countries, and that's got really grave consequences for us in the Pacific as well, because China will see opportunity perhaps to launch on Taiwan.
So the axis could be stronger coming out of this if this is done incorrectly.
Yeah, I believe that, yes.
building on that, with regard to the presence of North Korean troops, what are the bigger geopolitical implications there? I mean, what does North Korea get out of supporting Russia in the Ukraine war?
So Russia's kind of brought North Korea out of the cold diplomatically, so they're not as isolated as they once were. Kim Jong-un traveled to Russia to meet with Vladimir Putin. They've hosted Russian senior officials, Shoigu and Lavrov. So that's one thing. Secondly, for sure, the technology that they need for their military, dual-use technology. It's not a surprise that Putin and Kim Jong-un met at a Russian space facility. And the third thing is that Russia's currency is intelligence. You know, they collect a lot of intelligence on what they call the main enemy, Glavny Protivnik, the United States of America. That is of great interest to China, North Korea, and Iran. So the North Koreans value that, and they use it to mount all sorts of operations against us, hacking operations to steal Bitcoin or whatever they need to prop up their corrupt hermit kingdom regime.
You've also written a lot about the need for better U.S. intelligence collection at this moment when China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are aligning against the United States, but most specifically with regard to unlocking Mr. Putin's true plans and his pain points. Can you help us unpack your thinking on that? What are the most important things as the Trump administration seeks this re-engagement policy with Russia diplomatically? What are the most important things that the CIA should be focused on?
So I think, first of all, to put it in context, we face more wickedly complex threats to our national security today than we ever have before, and every single one of them has an intelligence component. So the job of the CIA and the intelligence community writ large, arguably more important today than it's ever been. I think Director Ratcliffe has probably three things he needs to be thinking about in a large sense. One is, for sure, more sources on those key national security threats, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, protecting those sources with the best tradecraft we have. We like to talk about ubiquitous technical surveillance and the challenges that that poses. We've got to be out front with better tradecraft. The second thing that the director needs to be doing is taking care of our people. When he was Secretary of Defense, Secretary Gates, who of course was Deputy Director at CIA and Director, used to talk about the thing that concerned him most was our people serving out on the front lines, and he's right. And so we haven't solved the Havana syndrome, and the Biden administration, that was, in my opinion, an intelligence failure. We need to solve that one. And if it's Russia who was responsible for targeting U.S. officials overseas and reportedly at the White House, well, we need to get to the bottom of that. Director Ratcliffe needs to figure that one out with sources and good source reporting. The Russians were also reportedly funneling money and weapons to the Taliban to kill our soldiers there during the war. That's another thing to hold Russia accountable for those things. And the third thing that's really important from the director CIA's perspective is, you know, you respect the office of the presidency, and the best way to do it is to tell the president, the White House, and our elected representatives in Congress what they need to know, especially when it's not what they want to hear. I've done that, and some leaders under whom I served, Leon Panetta, Dave Petraeus, they were great. You know, they didn't hold anything against you when you told them something that conflicted with their worldview or their assessment of the world. John Brennan, not so much. John Brennan took it personally and didn't have many fond things to say about me, even though it wasn't personal for me. I was just trying to tell him what he needed to know based on human intelligence or signals intelligence, whatever we had. I think it's going to be important for Director Ratcliffe to be able to walk into the White House and tell the president, hey, sir, here's what the intelligence says, even if it's something that may challenge the president's assumptions. If you respect the president and the office of the presidency, you got to be able to do that. And maybe most importantly, your own people see it. And that's what gives our officers overseas and the analysts at home the confidence to go out and do the job when we're all just seeking the truth.
Dan Hoffman, so interesting, so insightful. Very lucky to have you as a contributor to Threat Status. Ben Wolfgang, always lucky to work with you. Thank you both for joining this edition of the Threat Status Influencers Series. I'm Guy Taylor. Until next time.